what is a coffee roast profile? How do you create one? And how do you curate a coffee roast for your coffee? That's some of the stuff I'm going to be touching on here. Now, it's impossible to like do this all in one video, and it's impossible for me to do this for you. So you're going to have to experiment with this. You're going to have to play with it and really just like jump in. But for those of you who don't know like anything about coffee roasting or very little, or you're new to coffee roasting, this is going to be a perfect video for you just to like catch the basics. Okay, so what we have here is called a coffee roast profile. Just kind of outlining what we got. This y-axis is temperature in Fahrenheit. This x-axis is time in minutes. This green dotted line, what that represents is the temperature and time path that coffee takes along what's called a roast profile curve or a roast profile. So this is all made up, obviously. But right here, this is what we call the charge temperature. What charge temperature is when coffee is sitting up here in the hopper, you open the chute and the coffee drops into the roasting chamber. That point is called your charge. Okay? So from the charge, the temperature drops. Now, the coffee itself is room temperature, which is roughly 70, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. However, your roaster is preheated to somewhere in the neighborhood of 430 degrees, let's say. So what the temperature probe, which on this machine is in the back of the machine, what the temperature probe is reading is the internal temperature of the coffee roaster being at 430 degrees. Your 70 degree coffee hits that chamber, and what it does is it drops. So around the minute 30 mark, I'm going to use a blue marker here, we call it a turning point or turnaround. So most typically it's called a turning point. What that represents is when the temperature probe that is reading the coffee beans equalizes with the actual bean temperature of the coffee. So your bean temperature is coming from the 60 degree mark. And when those two things equalize, your charge temp, or the internal temperature of the roaster and the coffee beans, that becomes a turning point. That's more or less the start of the coffee roast. From there, a coffee roaster will apply a lot of times maximum heat or near maximum heat, like 80% to 100% of the heat capacity. And then your bean temperature and your internal temperature, or your heat input of the roaster and the bean temperature will go along this path. What this path is called is the roast profile. So around this 5 to 6 minute mark, what we're doing, or between here and here, what we're doing is we're driving out moisture. Oops, you need a big O. So the first roughly 5 to 6 minutes of the coffee roast, moisture is being driven out of the coffee. The reason we care about moisture being driven out, there are a couple reasons. So for one, heat is going into the bean. Simultaneously, moisture is trying to go out of the bean. The theory, as of 2025, is that as the heat is going in and the moisture is going out, it creates like a steam barrier. That steam barrier builds up pressure inside of the coffee bean, and that pressure that is built up, it actually has impacts later on, like talking about your 10, 11, 12 minutes of the roast. when you hit first crack and beyond, that pressure that builds up has positive impacts on the acidity and the overall like pop that the flavor of the coffee has. The other thing, as you're driving out moisture, is there are a couple reactions. The primary reaction being the Maillard reaction. It does not occur in a high moisture environment. So driving off moisture in this first stage of the coffee roast, what that allows to happen is greater flavor development between your like 6-minute mark and end of the roast. Okay? So your Maillard reaction is amino acids or proteins interacting with sugars or carbohydrates within the coffee. Caramelization is sugars interacting with sugars. The Maillard reaction, which is more complex, is proteins interacting with sugars. The Maillard reaction does not happen in a high moisture environment. Therefore, driving out this moisture in the first phase of the coffee roast, what it does is it leads to greater flavor development from the second half of the roast and beyond. Okay? So, the first phase of the roast, if you will, is moisture being driven out of the coffee. Once you hit this 5 to 6 minute mark, which typically is around the 360 degree level, your moisture is low, and then your caramelization and your Maillard reaction go up. Okay? So this is where your real flavor development really begins to happen. So if you can push out this moisture driving off phase, what the research is starting to show is that this phase of the roast regarding flavor development might not have a lot of impact on the flavor development itself. What it has an impact on is that pop or that accentuation of that flavor development. Okay? That'll make sense a little bit more when I start doing demonstrations on the roaster. Okay, so your 5 to 6 minute mark, we call this the yellowing. The reason that is, you have green coffee at this phase, the moisture drives out, the coffee actually changes to a hue of yellow. So your yellowing phase is when particularly the Maillard reaction begins to happen, as well as caramelization. All right, so you keep applying more heat, the roast keeps chugging along, and then you hit this, we'll just call it 9 minutes for the sake of this. What happens here is called first crack. Now, what first crack is as the temperature is rising, as thermodynamic heat is being applied to the coffee, as that steam is trying to escape and heat is trying to go in, as heat is transferring through the moisture of the coffee to a point that pressure of the coffee, or the pressure of the steam within the coffee, builds and builds and builds and builds. But I've heard as much as 20 atmospheres of pressure builds up within the coffee bean. At first crack, all that pressure finally overcomes the bean structure. That it pops open the coffee will roughly double in size, and you'll hear an audible pop like popcorn. That is first crack. And what's happening at first crack is that steam is escaping, that heat is escaping, more or less the last of the moisture within the coffee is escaping, and you are left with strictly like coffee bean matter and flavor and so forth. This is the equivalent of a steak being rare. It's like just barely enough done. that you can drink it. It's barely enough done that you can grind it without screwing up your grinder. The last of the moisture is gone. So first crack typically is around the 9-minute mark, maybe 10-minute, 15-minute mark in a drum roaster. First crack is like, hey, the coffee is drinkable. Now from there, if you look at this profile or this hypothetical heat, it really flattens out. So from 9 minutes to, we'll just say 12 minutes, 3 minutes, you're only gaining about 30 degrees of temperature. From here, you're going from 200 degrees of temperature to 390 in 9 minutes. So you're going 100, we'll just say 200 degrees of temperature in 9 minutes. And then you're going 30 degrees of temperature in 3 minutes. So what's happening, we call this the rate of rise. So if you look at how the coffee is rising in temperature, it's very rapidly, and then it tapers off, and then it really tapers off. So this is called your rate of rise, or ROR. It represents how quickly is the temperature of the coffee increasing and flattening out. So that's represented here. Your rate of rise at the beginning of the roast. Now this is like Scott Rao. If you study any of his stuff, you're looking at somewhere around 30 degrees per minute, maybe 25. A lot of it depends on the machinery that you're using. So at the beginning of the roast, you're going to have a really high rate of rise. Towards the end of the roast, you're looking at a 5 to 10 degree Fahrenheit per minute rate of rise. So you're basically flattening out the coffee roast profile. What that does is it allows for what's called a development, which is from your first crack to the end of the roast. It allows for a development time of X. So a typical development time, 20% is getting to be about the maximum that you want to do. Now 20% is of the entire roast. So if your roast is 10 minutes, 8 minutes comes up to here, and then your 8.01 minute to 10 minute is your 20% development. Now, in reality, the entire roast profile is development. But if you're looking at things from the standpoint of like what Scott Rao teaches, or just sort of like vernacular of the coffee roasting world, your development time refers to from first crack until the drop or the end of the roast. So I know this doesn't really like cover how to roast a particular coffee or how to roast coffee, but when you're talking about like a coffee roast profile or like a development time or something like that, that is basically like the giant mess that's going on in the heads of a coffee roaster. Now I'm going to expound on this in future videos and kind of like go from here. We're going to do some sample roasts, some sample cuppings, and then develop a actual coffee roast profile from scratch. I have 3 different Brazils, so we're going to be playing with at least one of those and expounding on this. But that's the craziness that we deal with when it comes to like coffee roasting, coffee roast profiles, rate of rise, development time, and like all these nutty things in our head. Later, dudes.